The first American weapon on Guadalcanal that could see farther than the human eye was not a fighter or a gun. It was a frame of steel tubes, wooden crates, and a canvas roof, the SCR-two-seventy radar. On the morning of September 2nd, 1942, it came ashore at Lunga Point with the Marines of the Cactus Air Force, carried in pieces through the mud and heat. It looked nothing like salvation. Its heart was a generator that coughed black smoke and a cathode screen that glowed faint green, a machine as fragile as the men who assembled it. Yet within weeks, that contraption would give Henderson Field something no other outpost in the Pacific possessed. Warning: before radar, the nights belonged to a ghost. The Marines called him Washing Machine Charlie. His twin engines, deliberately unsynchronized, produced a throbbing vibration that set every tin roof on the island humming. Charlie's purpose was not to bomb effectively, but to rob men of sleep, to remind them that the enemy was always overhead. Pilots would stumble to their aircraft half awake, and ground crews would curse the darkness, unable to tell whether the faint rumble meant danger or another prank of nerves. When the SCR-two-seventy began to breathe electricity, that uncertainty ended. The operators, a handful of radar technicians under Lieutenant Colonel Walter Bayler, learned to read the sky by echoes. They called their post the Cactus Air Warning Station. Their hut smelled of diesel, sweat, and cigarette smoke. A grease-penciled plexiglass board stood against one wall, covered in rings and marks like the face of a clock. Each blip on the screen became a black triangle on that board, updated every 30 seconds by a plotter who shouted bearings and ranges to a teller. The teller relayed to the controller, and the controller's calm voice reached the pilots warming engines on the coral strip. At first it was chaos, untrained men trying to synchronize machines built for laboratories. The radar could detect aircraft 100 miles away, but the operators had to distinguish friend from foe by pattern, altitude, and timing. The Japanese often flew in small formations at dawn or dusk, just when sea clutter painted false echoes. The Marines invented their own vocabulary to describe what they saw: angels for altitude, bogey for unknown, bandit for confirmed enemy. Those words, born in that sweaty hut, would become standard in every air defense network that followed. The first practical test came on the night of September 12th. The scope showed a cluster of returns forming north of the island 30, maybe 40 aircraft. Without radar, the defenders would have been caught refueling or sleeping. Instead, the controllers ordered the field dark, told the anti-aircraft crews to stand by, and launched what few Wildcats were serviceable. Minutes later, Japanese bombers passed through clouds lit by their own flares, expecting chaos below. Instead, they met gunfire already aimed in the right place. When the surviving bombers turned east, they left behind burning wrecks of their own making and a new respect for the strange American magic that had met them in the dark. From then on, the rhythm of life on Guadalcanal changed. Each day began not with sunrise but with the first report from the scope: raid bearing 310, range 90 miles. The controllers learned the quirks of their set, the blind zone directly overhead, the interference from tropical storms, the way heavy rain could make a flight appear to split in two. They learned that altitude mattered. Low-flying torpedo planes disappeared into sea clutter until they were too close to intercept. High bombers were clear as stars. By late 1942, the Cactus Air Warning Station could give 15 to 20 minutes notice of a raid, enough time to scramble fighters, warm engines, and clear the field. What they built in that crude shack was more than technology. It was a system of trust. The pilots learned to believe the voices they could not see. A typical warning went something like this: Raid 2, Angels 2 to 5, heading 150, 30 miles. The fighters climbed into cloud on that bearing and, more often than not, it met the enemy right where the scope had said he would be. They began to call the radar operators Angels 2, half in jest, half in gratitude. The Japanese never quite understood what was happening. Their reconnaissance pilots reported that the Americans seemed to launch interceptors only when they approached within a precise distance, never too early, never too late. They assumed spies or radio interception. In truth, it was mathematics and discipline. Every gallon of aviation fuel on Guadalcanal was precious. Each Wildcat could remain aloft barely an hour on combat patrol. The controllers learned to measure time and altitude like currency, rationing fighters as carefully as food. They saved airplanes by spending minutes wisely. By the time the rainy season ended, the radar crew had expanded to include Navy technicians and Signal Corps men rotating through from Hawaii. They repaired the generator nightly, replaced tubes scavenged from wrecked sets, and strung miles of field wire to connect their post to the command bunker. When the Japanese bombed the island on December 14th, a near miss blew out their hut's windows but left the radar intact. Within half an hour, they were tracking the retreating bombers by their fading echoes. In January 1943, a second SCR-2-70 arrived, followed by a smaller mobile set, the SCR-5-27. Now the system could triangulate, comparing bearings from two sites to compute precise courses. It was the birth of fighter direction in the Pacific. The term ground-controlled interception was not yet official, but the practice was already alive. Controllers issued vectors: turn right to heading 270, Angels 1 to 8, contact in 20 seconds. Pilots obeyed without question. The results spoke for themselves: fewer bomb hits, fewer losses, and an airfield that remained operational through the worst months of the campaign. The men of Cactus Air Warning never claimed glory. Their names rarely appeared in communiques. Yet the pilots knew who had bought them the minutes that separated life from death. Major John Smith, a Marine fighter ace, later wrote that the difference between scrambling blind and flying with radar guidance was the difference between swatting at shadows and meeting an enemy head-on. By the time the final Japanese air raid over Guadalcanal came, in February 1943, the outcome was certain before the first bomb fell. Radar picked up the attackers 80 miles out, and interceptors were already climbing through scattered cloud when the enemy crossed the coast. The Japanese dropped their loads blindly and fled into a sky alive, with tracers. Not a single bomb struck the runway. When dawn broke, the operators stepped from their hut and looked east across the sea. The air was quiet, the horizon clean. The generator still hummed behind them, its drone steady as a heartbeat. They had turned electrons into foresight, static into survival. The war would move on to New Georgia, to Bougainville, to the Philippines, but the template was set. Wherever the United States built an airfield, a radar detachment followed. The men who had learned to speak radar on Guadalcanal trained the next wave, teaching them that technology was only half the battle. The rest was composure, judgment, and the courage to trust a flickering green echo more than one's own eyes. In the humid nights of 1942, inside a hut lit by cigarettes and the dim, ghostly glow of a scope, a handful of Marines invented the art of seeing the unseen. Henderson Field survived because they learned that victory could begin with a whisper of static and a calm voice saying, "Raid detected bearing 310, range 90." In that moment, the invisible became real, and the first radar shield of the Pacific was born. By the spring of 1943, the technology that had kept Henderson Field alive was already spreading northward. Guadalcanal was secure, but the war was now moving toward the Solomon Chain, New Georgia, Bougainville, and the Bismarcks beyond. The lessons of the Cactus Air Warning had traveled with the veterans who had built it, along with a doctrine that was still more art than science: that radar could fight fatigue, distance, and surprise if men learned to hear what it said. On the island of Espiritu Santo, a new network took shape beneath the palms. There was no front line here, only warehouses, repair depots, and staging fields where aircraft gathered before moving into the combat zone. Yet it was from these rear bases that the first dedicated radar fighter control centers emerged, an experiment in marrying electronics to command. The United States Navy called it Air Defense Direction. The men who ran it called it Listening for Ghosts. The sets were still primitive. The SCR-2-70, with its tall antenna and bulky transmitter, could detect formations out to 120 miles, but it could not tell altitude. The newer SCR-527 was more portable but fragile, with vacuum tubes that burned out faster than replacements could arrive. In the humidity of the South Pacific, the simplest malfunction could turn a warning network into silence. Each night, technicians wrapped the components in canvas and buried them beneath tarps against the rain. Every morning, they unwrapped them like relics and coaxed them back to life with solder and prayer. Radar operators on Espiritu Santo soon learned that their enemy was no longer just the bomber at altitude, it was the night fighter, a weapon born of desperation. By mid-1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy had begun sending twin-engine Gecko and Betty bombers on harassment raids against the growing American bases. They came in low, often below radar coverage, guided by the phosphorescent line of breaking surf. The Japanese called these missions Totsugeki special attacks. The Americans called them snoopers. At first, there was little defense. Night fighters were scarce. Only a few Lockheed P-38 seconds and modified F-4U Corsairs had the range and instrumentation to patrol after dark. Ground spotters relied on sound and guesswork. Then, in June of 1943, a handful of Navy controllers at Espiritu Santo decided to try something untested. They would use radar not merely to warn, but to guide a fighter through darkness vector by vector to an intercept point invisible to both men. The experiment was clumsy and tense. Lieutenant Edward "Red" Erickson, a Minnesota radio engineer turned naval officer, manned the controller's position. His pilot was Lieutenant James Mac McClanahan of Marine Fighting Squadron 2-23, flying a radarless F-4U Corsair fitted with extra fuel tanks. The target, a returning Japanese reconnaissance aircraft detected 60 miles north, flying at 1,500 feet. Erickson's voice reached McClanahan's headphones through static and distance. Turn heading 050, range 58 miles. Angels 1.5. What followed was 20 minutes of blind flight guided entirely by the unseen hand of the radar beam. The Corsair pilot reported nothing but stars and ocean until, without warning, his gun sight filled with the dark outline of a twin-engine silhouette illuminated by moonlight. The intercept was perfect by mathematics alone. McClanahan's bursts tore through the bomber's fuselage, and flames spiraled down into the water. When he returned to base, he said only, "Tell that radar man he's the best set of eyes I ever borrowed." That night became legend among the radar units of the South Pacific. It proved what many suspected but few dared to attempt, that radar could turn the night into an ally. The experiment was repeated across the theater, refined, standardized, and eventually named Ground Controlled Interception, or GCI. The controllers developed their own rituals. They worked in blackout huts, the only light the ghostly sweep of a cathode ray tube. Every blip that moved differently from the pattern of returning American bombers became a heartbeat on the screen. They learned to speak in a cadence that pilots could understand, short, calm, precise. Turn left to 210, range 25, closing fast. Those who stammered washed out, those who spoke like metronomes saved lives. To coordinate this new system, the 13th Fighter Command established a radar direction center at Bomber 1 Strip, Espiritu Santo. From here, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Woods oversaw what he called a symphony of electrons. Each radar site reported bearing and range. Plotters marked these on transparent boards. Interceptors were launched, their positions updated by radio from ground control, while liaison officers coordinated with searchlights and anti-aircraft batteries. For the first time in the Pacific, the night sky was charted not by eyesight but by radio echo. By September, Japanese losses began to mount. Crews who had once bombed unopposed now found fighters waiting in the dark. The Gecko, once confident in its speed, became prey to P-38 seconds climbing invisibly through cloud. Pilots described tracers appearing from nowhere, a string of red pearls cutting across the blackness. What had been a one-sided game of terror became a duel fought by unseen minds. The Japanese reacted with countermeasures. They flew at treetop level, hoping radar beams would skip over them. They attacked during tropical storms, using thunderclouds as cover. Chaff-thin strips of foil copied from British window reports leaked through intelligence channels. The radar operators countered in turn, adjusting gain controls, identifying false echoes by movement, and relying increasingly on experience rather than instruments alone. The best controllers could tell, by the flicker of a trace, whether it was weather or wings. It was on Espiritu-Santo that a phrase entered the vocabulary of radar war: talk them in. It described the act of guiding a pilot who saw nothing, who trusted his life to a voice and a green shadow. Operators compared it to threading a needle in fog. The men who could do it well were treasured, and their reputations spread from island to island. When the Japanese night attacks finally ceased in early 1944, it was not because of exhaustion or shortage of planes, but because they could no longer surprise. Their raids now ended in ambush, their radio transmissions betrayed by American direction finders, their flight paths illuminated by radar long before they reached target range. In those months, the Americans had learned to hear the Pacific breathe. The radar's hum became a kind of heartbeat that never stopped. Each blip on the screen was a life in motion, friend or foe, salvation or death. And as the war moved north, the lessons carried forward with every new airstrip and every new antenna. The night, once a weapon of fear, had become measurable. The long eyes of Espiritu-Santo had opened, and they would never close again. Before dawn broke over Guadalcanal on April 18, 1943, a handful of American officers studied a map so secret that it would later be locked in a steel vault under the War Department. The red line drawn across the blue expanse of the Solomon Sea did not mark a defensive patrol or a bombing route. It marked an ambush, one that had been calculated to the minute, the mile, and the heartbeat of an engine. The mission's name was Operation Vengeance. The target was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the man who had conceived the attack on Pearl Harbor. American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had cracked the Japanese naval cipher JN-25, revealing his inspection tour across the northern Solomons. The intercepted message even listed the times of departure and arrival: 6 sharp from Rabaul, 10:20 at Balalai airstrip. It was a rare opportunity, one that demanded precision on a scale the Pacific War had never seen. Major John Mitchell, commanding officer of the 339th Fighter Squadron, studied the figures with his deputy, Captain Thomas Lanphier. They both understood what made the plan extraordinary. It would depend on geometry rather than luck. The P-38s chosen for the mission had to fly from Guadalcanal to Bougainville, nearly 1,000 miles round trip, staying low over the ocean to avoid radar detection. There would be no margin for error. At 6:25 that morning, 18 P-38s lifted from Fighter 2 strip, each loaded with external tanks to stretch their range. The pilots' altimeters read barely 50 feet above the waves. "Keep it down!" Mitchell's voice crackled over the interphone. "If they see us, it's over." The aircraft's twin Allison engines droned like distant thunder as the formation slipped north beneath the radar horizon. In the Japanese command posts at Rabaul, coastal watchers reported nothing. The Imperial radar operators at Buka and Shortland Islands scanned their scopes and saw only the sea's natural static. The American flight path and oblique approach from the southeast had been designed specifically to exploit that blindness. Yamamoto's own itinerary was betraying him. The Americans were using his punctuality as a weapon. At precisely 9:34, the radar at Shortland Islands detected faint echoes moving along the coast. Yamamoto's escort of Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers and Zero fighters. The information reached the Americans' listening stations at Guadalcanal, confirming that the operation was unfolding exactly as planned. What followed was not chance. It was choreography executed at the edge of endurance. Mitchell's formation arrived off Bougainville within a minute of the calculated intercept. "We're at the gate," he told his men. Let's open it. The fighters split into two groups, the top cover to hold off the Zeros, and the lower element Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber to strike the bombers. At 10:34 local time, the Americans sighted two twin-engine silhouettes glinting against the jungle. Lanphier banked left and dove. Barber followed. In the next 60 seconds, the geometry of radar, mathematics, and discipline resolved into fire. Barber's P-38 came in behind the lead, Betty. He saw the rising sun insignia painted on the tail and the flashes of return fire from the dorsal gun. 3 long bursts from his 450 caliber guns raked the fuselage. Smoke erupted from the starboard engine. The aircraft rolled, broke apart, and plunged into the jungle near Buin. The time was 10:35. The wreckage would later yield Yamamoto's body, still seated in his chair, his gloved hand on the hilt of his sword. The mission's success owed as much to what the Japanese did not see as to what the Americans did. Their radar, limited in range and hampered by mountainous terrain, had been outflanked. The Americans had used the Earth's curvature, the radar horizon, as a shield. By flying low for nearly 5 hours, they had rendered themselves invisible to every Japanese detection system in the Solomons. It was the first great demonstration of radar's other lesson, that invisibility could be engineered through understanding. The post-mission debriefing at Guadalcanal revealed a revelation far greater than one admiral's death. The controllers and planners realized that radar was not simply a tool for seeing, it was a geometry for not being seen. By studying the limitations of Japanese early warning sets, they could design flight paths that slipped through gaps in coverage, timing intercepts to strike at the moment the enemy felt safest. When Lieutenant Colonel Jack Cram of the 13th Fighter Command summarized the lessons, he wrote in his logbook, "Speed beats fuzzes, but timing beats speed." His words would later become doctrine for radar-directed air operations. The mission had proven that victory could be achieved through placement rather than sheer firepower, that the science of interception worked both ways. In Tokyo, news of Yamamoto's death was kept secret for weeks. In Washington, it was celebrated quietly, for fear of revealing how deeply Japanese codes had been penetrated. But within the radar huts of the Pacific, the story became a parable. Operators whispered about the long ambush, the mission where men had flown by mathematics and returned by miracle. They studied the route like priests studying scripture, tracing the dotted line that bent beneath every radar cone and emerged in the 1 square mile where destiny waited. The impact of Operation Vengeance on Allied doctrine was immediate. Fighter direction officers began to think of radar not merely as a warning system but as a strategic weapon. It could sculpt the airspace, dictate where the enemy could or could not exist. The mission also revealed the psychological power of invisibility. The Japanese pilots, trained to rely on visual contact, could not comprehend an attack that came from nowhere. Their confidence in their own defenses began to erode. By the time the 13th Fighter Command prepared for the Bougainville and New Georgia campaigns later that year, radar planning was integral to every major operation. Routes, altitudes, and rendezvous points were computed against Japanese detection zones, and American controllers learned to exploit shadow corridors, regions where the enemy's equipment could not reach. The operators who had guided Wildcats over Guadalcanal were now writing the first manual on radar deception and fighter control in the Pacific. To the men of the radar units, Operation Vengeance was more than revenge. It was proof of concept, the moment when electronics, intellect, and endurance fused into something new. They understood now that mastery of the electromagnetic spectrum was as decisive as mastery of the sea. Years later, when historians asked one of the surviving radar officers of the 13th Fighter Command what he remembered most about that day, he did not mention Yamamoto's fall. He said, "I remember the silence. We listened to our scopes, waiting for a Japanese warning call that never came. It was like the whole Pacific was holding its breath. In that silence lay the future of air warfare, the realization that the side which controlled the unseen would always strike first and last." The lesson of the long ambush was not just that Admiral Yamamoto had been killed, it was that radar had rewritten the laws of pursuit and surprise. The Pacific night, once ruled by eyes and luck, now belonged to men who could read echoes and draw conclusions in the dark. By late 1943, the sound of generators and the flicker of radar scopes had become as common on Pacific islands as the whine of propellers. The United States had discovered that radar, once a single pair of eyes on Guadalcanal, could become an orchestra, a chain of watchers stretching over hundreds of miles. The men who once worked in solitary huts now formed a web that listened to the sky from New Georgia to Bougainville to the Marshalls. It was called the Air Warning Network, though to those who kept it alive, it was something more like a nervous system, one that pulsed with static and information instead of blood. The link of that network was established at Munda Point. Engineers of the U.S. Signal Corps hauled their SCR-270 by barge through swamp and coral until its antenna stood overlooking the sea like a skeletal lighthouse. It was joined by two mobile SCR-527s, each mounted on trucks that could move when bombardment threatened. Cables ran from the radar posts to a central command dugout, where operators hunched over plotting boards slick with sweat. Here, Lieutenant Henry Hank Kesselring of the 13th Fighter Command improvised the first regional radar schedule. Each set would scan a different sector, overlapping fields of detection like ripples on water. The Japanese soon learned that their old harassment tactics no longer worked. Their reconnaissance aircraft were intercepted at ranges they had thought impossible. The new radar posts could see as far as 150 miles in clear air, and even low-flying torpedo planes, once invisible, now betrayed themselves by faint, skipping echoes that sharp-eyed operators learned to recognize. Every night we'd hear them before we saw them, one Marine radar man recalled. You could almost feel their approach through the headphones, the hum thickening, the sweep filling with ghosts. But technology was only half the equation. The other half was coordination. In the early months of the war, each radar post acted alone. Now, with dozens of sites scattered across the islands, the challenge became how to fuse their information. The answer came in the form of the Fighter Control Center, a structure of coconut logs and sandbags with a concrete floor and a single elevated plotting table surrounded by telephones. Each radar site reported bearings and ranges at timed intervals, synchronized by radio pulses transmitted every 15 minutes from Espiritu Santo. Operators at the center combined those reports into a single moving picture of the airspace. By January 1944, the network stretched across 600 miles of ocean. Messages traveled from outposts to the Fighter Control Center through field lines laid underwater and by shortwave relay. When an enemy formation appeared, the information flowed like current through copper. First, the outer station spotted the blip, then the middle station confirmed it, then the center issued orders to scramble fighters. Average reaction time, 7 minutes. That meant the difference between losing fuel depots and intercepting bombers before they reached target altitude. The system worked so well that when the Japanese Navy mounted a major strike on Bougainville in March 1944, 50 bombers, with fighter escort, the Americans were waiting. The outermost radar at Green Island detected them 120 miles away. Within 4 minutes, controllers at the central post on Piva had vector commands ready. P-38 seconds, and Corsairs climbed into position, while the radar operators tracked the radar's course, like a heartbeat across their screens. The intercept occurred 25 miles from the beachhead. By the time the bombers reached the coast, half had been shot down or scattered. The radar crews never saw the battle, but they heard the sharp cutouts on their scopes as planes fell from the sky. Japanese intelligence eventually captured fragments of radar manuals from crashed aircraft and abandoned outposts. Their scientists at Yokosuka analyzed them with disbelief. The United States had not only deployed radar on a massive scale, it had created a command language around it, a way of thinking that fused engineering with tactics. The Japanese tried to copy it, but shortages of components and training doomed their efforts. Their own radar remained blind beyond 50 miles, and coordination between units broke down under strain. For the men who manned the American radar network, victory was measured in silence the nights when no bombs fell, because interceptors arrived too soon. They learned to trust the unseen, to feel the sky through instruments. When new equipment arrived lighter, more powerful SCR-602 sets, they replaced the old ones without ceremony, burying the worn-out tubes in the sand. Yet even as technology advanced, the human rhythm stayed constant. The low hum of the generator, the sweep of the beam, the voice over the radio saying, "Raid bearing 315, Angels 10. By the time the campaign moved toward the Marianas, the radar chain had become an invisible front, stretching from Guadalcanal to Kwajalein. It no longer merely warned, it directed. The network could track returning bombers, guide damaged aircraft to safe landings, and even coordinate night interceptions across hundreds of miles. In the dim light of their huts, the operators knew they had built something more enduring than any airstrip or pier. They had built the first American shield in the Pacific, a system of hearing, seeing, and predicting that would soon leap from the jungle to the open ocean, where floating radar posts would sail with the fleets. The islands could hear now, and they were speaking the language of victory. By mid-1944, the radar huts that once guarded lonely island runways had gone to sea. The American advance up the Solomons had transformed into a leap across the central Pacific, and radar had come with it, lashed to masts, wired into plotting rooms, and crewed by sailors who had learned to read echoes as fluently as any Marine on Guadalcanal. Where once radar was a handful of fragile sets hidden under camouflage nets, it was now an arm of the fleet itself, a weapon of timing, not firepower. The carriers of Task Force 58, sweeping westward toward the Marianas, carried radar as both shield and sword. On the island of Majuro, technicians of the Naval Air Technical Training Center trained hundreds of radar operators to direct night fighters from the decks of moving ships. They learned new call signs, new procedures, and a new lexicon. The old Cactus control phrases of Guadalcanal, turn starboard 210, range 20, were now joined by naval precision. Vector red 2, Angels 12, bogey course 275, closing fast. At the heart of each carrier's combat information center, the same drama repeated nightly. Dim red lamps glowed over radar scopes as young ensigns, many barely out of college, watched the luminous sweeps for the faint, uncertain glimmer that meant danger. The new SG and SK radar sets could see 150 miles across the sea and sky, their antennas spinning endlessly like blind sentinels. Each sweep painted the world in radio waves, the atolls, the weather fronts, the incoming aircraft, and behind each echo was a decision. The Japanese had not been idle. After the loss of their forward bases in the Solomons, they began dispatching long-range night bombers from Truk and Palau. These were not raids meant to destroy carriers, but to harass, to force the fleet to waste fuel and sleep. Pilots nicknamed the enemy Washing Machine Charlie, just as the Marines once had. But the Navy's answer was new. From the decks of the USS Enterprise, Hellcat night fighters, each equipped with the AN/APS-6 airborne radar, took off under guidance from shipboard controllers. Those controllers, standing before the green glowing scopes, were heirs to the men of Espiritu Santo and Guadalcanal. They guided their fighters not through jungle night, but through open ocean darkness, coordinating altitude and range by echo alone. You are clear to intercept, range 12, target bearing 085, the controller would say, watching two blips converge. Moments later, over the radio, contact visual guns firing. A streak of flame would vanish from the scope, one less ghost in the night. The system worked because it was layered. Picket destroyers stationed 30 miles ahead of the carriers carried smaller radar sets, acting as the fleet's outer ears. Behind them, escort carriers launched patrols every hour, forming an airborne curtain that could detect enemy bombers long before they reached torpedo range. When the Japanese tried to confuse the system by sending small groups at different altitudes, the controllers learned to distinguish them by the rhythm of the returns, fast or slow, clustered or single. Radar had become instinct. The radar pickets also paid the highest price. Their isolation made them targets for kamikazes once Japan turned to desperation. On the destroyer USS Evans, radar operator Seaman First Class Raymond Hughes recorded in his log for April 11, 1945. Multiple bogeys inbound, bearing 340 speed, estimated 200 knots. Controller vectoring, cap, intercept. One contact splashed. Second contact diving signal lost impact starboard. The next entry, written by a replacement, reads simply, Evans lost forward section but still afloat. The radar crew had given their final warning before dying at their posts, yet each sacrifice refined the system. Fleet commanders demanded faster coordination between radar detection and fighter response. The result was the Fighter Director School at Pearl Harbor, a crucible where radar officers and aviators trained side by side. They learned the new doctrine called positive control. A fighter would never fly blind but be continuously guided until the kill. In the fall of 1944, as the Navy advanced toward the Philippines, this doctrine reached perfection. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot radar on the USS Lexington detected incoming Japanese aircraft 150 miles away. Controllers calmly vectored 300 Hellcats to intercept. The result was annihilation. 350 enemy planes destroyed for minimal American loss. The battle was fought largely through voices and echoes, men who never saw their enemy until it was too late for the enemy to matter. Admiral Raymond Spruance later said that radar had turned night into a weaponized hour. Where once darkness favored the attacker, it now protected the defender, and the Japanese knew it. Their surviving pilots began flying lower, hugging the sea to escape detection, or attacking in silence with engines throttled back. But even that no longer fooled the screens. Operators had learned to read the faint, uneven glow of ground clutter that betrayed a low-flying aircraft. The sea talks back, one sailor said. You just have to know how to listen. By the end of 1944, radar had become the unseen admiral of the Pacific Fleet. It directed planes, guarded convoys, warned of ambushes, and even tracked the great typhoons that once scattered fleets without mercy. What had begun as a single antenna rising from the mud of Guadalcanal had become an empire of signals spanning the ocean. And behind each signal stood men who, without ever firing a gun, had changed the shape of war. The sea could listen now, and it whispered America's advance. By the spring of 1944, Japanese pilots flying over the Marianas began to sense that something invisible was stalking them. Their navigators would mark positions carefully, radio bearings to base, and yet somehow the Americans were always waiting. Night after night, returning bombers found their airfields under fire, their formation routes anticipated with eerie precision. It was as though the Americans could see through the dark. In truth, they could. The islands and seas of the Pacific now whispered everything to radar. When the United States captured Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, it inherited not only new airfields but commanding positions for radar coverage. The Signal Corps moved swiftly, installing SCR-270 and SCR-527 systems across the volcanic ridges. From these vantage points, operators could see hundreds of miles out to sea. The radar at Mount Tapashau alone tracked aircraft approaching from Iwo Jima at 180 miles. In bunkers lit only by the ghostly sweep of cathode rays, young technicians with headphones plotted raids before the enemy even knew they were detected. The Japanese tried to strike back using new tactics, fast night intrusions by twin-engine Yokosuka P-1Y Francis bombers and stealthy reconnaissance planes flying low over the ocean. But by now, the Americans had developed countermeasures that turned darkness into a trap. On Guam, the 13th Fighter Command introduced GCI Team's ground-controlled interception. Using the SCR-527's precision sweep, controllers talked pilots toward unseen targets with calm voices. A typical exchange ran like a script: raid bearing 075, range 55. Roger. Climbing to Angels 12. Turn starboard 5 degrees, steady, contact range 20. Then, a pause. The radar operators would see 2 blips merge into one. Moments later, the second vanished. Another night intruder was gone, its pilot never understanding how he'd been found. Japan's own radar defenses lagged hopelessly behind. Their Type 2 Model 1 early warning sets, built under constant resource shortages, operated at half the range of the American systems. Worse, their operators lacked training and power supplies. Many were forced to shut down during daylight to conserve fuel for generators. Allied intelligence later found entire radar sites without spare tubes or cables, empty husks listening to a sky they could no longer read. On the American side, radar now guided every movement. When B-29 superfortresses began operating from the Marianas, their massive formations depended on radar-controlled takeoffs and assembly. Ground stations on Tinian used precision beacons to align hundreds of aircraft into tight streams over the ocean. At the same time, ship-based radars created an invisible fence around the islands. Japanese raiders approaching from the Bonins were tracked for hours before arrival. By autumn 1944, radar superiority had shifted the entire rhythm of Pacific warfare. The Japanese could no longer launch surprise attacks. Their bases, once protected by distance and darkness, were exposed. The American night fighters, Hellcats and Black Widows fitted with onboard radar roamed the skies like predators with second sight. In one recorded intercept near Iwo Jima, Captain Everett Greening of the 548th Night Fighter Squadron located and destroyed 2 Betty bombers within 6 minutes of detection. His combat report was clinical. Target held visually for 4 seconds. Engagement concluded. No return fire observed. Even the seas could not hide the enemy. Radar-directed Navy gunners learned to fire blind through clouds and darkness. At Leyte Gulf, destroyers used radar ranges to track torpedo boats invisible to the naked eye, sinking them with uncanny accuracy. By early 1945, every major American fleet operation used radar as its primary source of tactical awareness. The ocean had become a map written in echoes. For Japan, the effect was psychological as much as material. Pilots began reporting ghost fighters, American aircraft appearing suddenly out of blackness, striking once, then vanishing. Air crews flying from Truk or Formosa spoke of the eye that sees through rain. In captured diaries, fear replaced bravado. One Japanese officer wrote in December 1944, "We fight men who are guided by invisible hands. We are children in the dark." On Okinawa, the final chapter of radar warfare unfolded with brutal clarity. The radar picket ships' destroyers stationed on the front line warned of kamikaze formations hours before they arrived. Though many pickets were struck, their sacrifice saved the fleet. Each minute of early warning meant hundreds of lives spared. From bunkers on Karama, Reto, fighter directors guided Hellcats against suicide planes, their calm voices cutting through static and chaos. Bandits closing range 15 Vector Blue 300 good kill. By the war's final months, radar had done more than outsmart Japan's night fighters. It had erased their ability to fight unseen. What began as a handful of Marines on Guadalcanal hunched over flickering screens had grown into an empire of perception spanning the Pacific. Radar operators now guided bombers to Tokyo, ships through typhoons, and fighters through darkness. They had made the night itself an ally. In the quiet after victory, historians searching the archives of the 13th Fighter Command found a small plaque once nailed inside a radar hut on Guam. The paint was faded, but the words were still legible. "We do not fight with guns or planes, we fight with time and with sight." Those words captured the essence of radar's triumph, a victory not of force, but of foresight. The war in the Pacific had ended not only because Japan's armies were defeated, but because its skies had gone blind. When the war at last reached its silence in August 1945, the operators who had manned the radar huts, the shipboard scopes, and the island outposts looked around and realized they had been part of something larger than they could see. Victory had come not only through fire and iron, but through perception, the quiet mastery of the unseen. Radar, born in secrecy and sustained by improvisation, had reshaped the Pacific War more completely than any single weapon. It had turned the dark ocean into a map, the night sky into a chart, and uncertainty into advantage. At Guam, the 13th Fighter Command shut down its last continuous watch on August 14th. Lieutenant Henry Kesselring, who had overseen the early radar nets across the Solomons, signed the final log. No bogeys, all quiet. For nearly 3 years, there had never been such a night. Men who had lived by the pulse of the radar sweep every rotation. A heartbeat stood in the still air and felt disoriented by silence. Some kept listening through the headphones long after the power was cut, half expecting the familiar hum to return. Across the Pacific, radar had become so woven into operations that its presence was almost invisible. A B-29 navigator above the Sea of Japan guided his bomber by the AN/APQ-13 radar, tracing coastlines through cloud. Destroyer captains trusted the green echoes on their scopes more than the horizon. Air-sea rescue pilots followed radar beacons to pull downed airmen from storms. The electromagnetic spectrum had become America's most valuable battlefield. The Japanese, after surrender, confronted the full scale of their defeat in this unseen war. At Atsugi Airfield, American intelligence officers interviewed engineers from the Imperial Army's Radar Bureau. They found prototypes of sets patterned after and captured British and American designs, most never fielded. "We lacked the copper and the power," one exhausted Japanese technician admitted. "We could build the box, but not feed it." Allied translators discovered logs showing that by early 1945, Japan's radar network could detect less than 10% of Allied flights. Their signals were weak, their plotting delayed, and their command lines in chaos. The night had truly turned against them. At sea, the lessons of radar became doctrine. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz reviewed reports from the radar picket destroyers at Okinawa. "Their heroism," he wrote, "proved the eyes of the fleet can never close." The Navy established a permanent radar development board, and carrier task groups were redesigned around information flow rather than gun range. Every modern combat information center, windowless, glowing, alive with data, traced its ancestry to the huts of Guadalcanal and the dark rooms of Task, Force 58. The human cost of this technological revolution lingered quietly. Many radar men returned home unheralded. Their stories lacked the glamour of pilots or submariners. They had fought with patience and mathematics. Corporal David Summers, who served on a radar hill at Munda, later wrote, "We didn't shoot. We pointed. Every kill came through our cables, but no medals followed the wires. Yet their work had saved thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, by ensuring that American fighters met the enemy in the sky instead of over burning runways or troop ships." In the years after the war, radar's legacy rippled outward. The same systems that had tracked raiders now guided aircraft through civilian skies. The Federal Aviation Administration's first radar towers were direct descendants of the SCR-2-70 that once guarded Henderson Field. Weather radar emerged from the same laboratories, its discoveries born from engineers who had once tried to distinguish rain from bombers. The war's invisible language, bearing, range, azimuth, became the vocabulary of peacetime safety. In 1950, when the Korean War erupted, radar veterans from the Pacific were called back to teach a new generation. They spoke not of machines, but of discipline. How to trust an echo more than instinct. How to see patterns in chaos. How to make the invisible an ally. One instructor at Fort Monmouth summarized it simply, "Radar doesn't win battles. It lets men win them." Historians would later argue that the true revolution of the Pacific War was not the atomic bomb, but the radar network that made its delivery possible. Without the chain of stations across the Marianas, without the radar-directed escort fighters and the navigational beacons, the long-range raids on Japan could not have been flown. Radar had stretched the reach of air power until distance itself ceased to be protection. Yet those who had lived through it remembered the human scale of the struggle, the nights of rain inside bamboo huts, the smell of ozone from overloaded generators, the voices calling bearings through static. They remembered the first time a blip appeared where no eyes could see, and the quiet satisfaction of hearing, minutes later, the confirmation: bandit destroyed. When asked after the war what radar had truly meant, one veteran of the 13th Fighter Command said, "It taught us that vision isn't about light, it's about information." In that single sentence lay the essence of the Allied triumph. Radar had transformed warfare from an act of reaction into one of anticipation. It had given the Allies the power to predict, to prepare, to know. On a quiet evening in 1946, a decommissioned SCR-2-seventy set sat abandoned on a ridge above Apra Harbour. Its dish, rusted and silent, faced the same horizon it once watched endlessly. A passing pilot, circling for approach, could still see its silhouette against the setting sun, a monument to the moment when men learned to command the unseen. The Pacific had once been a sea of blindness. Radar had taught it to see, and in that revelation lay the end of one world and the beginning of another. The war of shadows was over, but its echoes would guide humanity long after the guns fell silent. When peace settled over the Pacific, the radar men returned home to find a world that no longer understood the language they spoke. Their terms bearing, range, azimuth, pulse rate belonged to a vanished war fought not with bullets but with reflections. Yet in laboratories, airports, and classrooms, that language began to take root again, quietly reshaping how humanity moved, navigated, and even lived. The war's unseen inheritance was about to transform peacetime itself. In early 1946, the War Department authorized the dismantling of most Pacific radar networks. Towers were taken down, dishes crated for scrap, and generator huts abandoned to jungle and salt. But a few installations survived, turned over to scientific research. One such site, on Mount Santa Rosa in Guam, was reactivated under the Office of Naval Research, not to watch for bombers, but to study the weather. Engineers noticed that rain squalls produced distinct blotches on radar screens. The realization birthed meteorological radar, storm detection from the same instruments that had once guided interceptors. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Civil Aeronautics Authority adopted wartime radar to control post-war air traffic. In December 1946, LaGuardia Airport tested the first ground-controlled approach system. Pilots descending through fog heard voices eerily familiar to any combat veteran. Turn left. Heading 180, reduce altitude 500 feet, steady, runway in sight. It was Guadalcanal's fighter control reborn for civilian safety. The men who once guided night fighters now guided passenger planes through storms. In the private sector, Lockheed and Boeing engineers, many of them veterans of the radar-equipped bomber programs, began designing transponders that would allow aircraft to identify themselves automatically. The term IFF, once meaning identification, friend or foe, quietly transformed into transponder code. The radar web that had once protected convoys was being remade into the skeleton of global aviation. The military, too, never forgot the lesson. By 1948, the United States established a permanent continental radar defense network. The new AN/FPS long-range sets could detect aircraft 500 miles away, their pulses stronger and cleaner than anything dreamed of on Guadalcanal. The idea of an unseen early warning line would evolve into the distant early warning DEW system of the Cold War, stretching across Alaska and Canada like a wall of echoes. The men who built it were the same who once patched cables through jungle mud, now working in Arctic ice. In Tokyo, under Allied supervision, Japan's own scientists began rebuilding their technological base. Many had worked on crude radar sets during the war. Now, under American occupation, they turned to peaceful electronics, communications, television, and navigation. The companies that would later become Sony and Toshiba emerged from research teams that once tried to jam American radar. Their wartime defeat in the electromagnetic realm became the seed of post-war innovation. Culturally, radar had changed how soldiers thought about perception. The concept of situational awareness, born in the darkened huts of the fighter control centers, entered doctrine and psychology. Future air forces would teach their pilots not just to look, but to sense, to imagine the invisible geometry of space. In this way, radar rewired the human idea of vision itself. By the time the Korean War erupted in 1950, the new generation of operators sat in rooms filled with oscilloscopes and glowing cathode tubes, tracing the ghosts of MiGs over the Yalu River. Their procedures were nearly identical to those written on Guadalcanal in 1942. The cycle detection, identification, interception remained the same. The machines were faster, the principles eternal. Back in the Pacific, the old radar sites decayed quietly. On Bougainville, vines overtook the concrete pedestals of the SCR-270. At Henderson Field, children played around rusted antenna mounts without knowing that their island had once been the ear of a war. Yet some veterans returned in later years, walking the same ridges they had watched for echoes from. Sergeant Thomas Malloy of the original Cactus Air Warning Detachment visited in 1960 and found the remnants of the plotting hut still visible. "It was small," he said, "but from here we saw everything." As the world entered the atomic age, the legacy of radar endured not in weaponry but in structure. Every control tower, every Coast Guard station, every weather warning traced its ancestry to those nights when young men learned to listen to the air. Radar had done more than detect, it had taught humanity to think ahead of disaster. In museums decades later, the machines themselves appeared primitive boxes of tubes, dials, and humming transformers. Yet beside them, visitors could read the statistics: sorties saved, bombers intercepted, fleets preserved. One plaque in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum bears a line from an unknown operator written on a scrap of paper found at Munda Point. "When you see the enemy before he sees you, you already hold the future." The War of Shadows had ended long ago, but its echoes lived on in every flight path tracked across a glowing scope, in every storm avoided, in every calm voice guiding someone home through darkness. The men who once bent over flickering screens in the jungles of the Pacific had changed the very nature of vision. They had taught the world that knowledge could travel faster than fear, and that sometimes the most decisive victories are won by those who simply learn how to listen to the invisible.